Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 4, Schools, Tests, and Competitions in Chinese Tea Ceremony. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan Ahn. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason.
Hello.
My first question. This very short section is a strong argument for a particular viewpoint, a particular method that I propose has the best chance, the best methodology, the best structure for driving the praxis forward in the contemporary modern world we find ourselves in. How would you summarize that stance, and how would you argue for or against it?
So Jason, you're definitely advocating for tea brewing competitions, which I think it's good to mention up front that that's very separate from tea competitions where brewing is an element, like the Lugu Farmer Association competition. So brewing where someone is showing off their skill, a lot like the World Barista Champion style competition. So I believe what you're summarizing is essentially leaning on the cultural and social capital of the trusted judges, where we rely on them to decide on what the judging criteria is and the judgments that they're making across the variables that will be taken into account during the competition. And because we can rely on this panel of trusted judges, that it would be accepted by the largest number of practitioners. Jason, would you say that's a good characterization of your argument?
It's a viable characterization. I would not say that I believe that the competitions are necessary or required or a personal focus. I would certainly say that in comparison to what exists today and in comparison to commercially viable methodologies of moving the praxis forward in a top-down methodology, that of the various institutions or structures, I do believe that competitions are the most likely to succeed in a positive transformation. It's about the development of progressively improving technique. So just as in coffee, the use of EK43 coffee grinders, uniform coffee grind distribution, polishing, was all developed during the World Barista Champion. I think that similar things could happen in tea.
I guess to answer the second part of your question around, what counter argument can I think of? You discuss in the book of the 3 levels of practice being utilitarian, structural functionalist, and then the meta theory phenomenology. And when practicing at the highest levels, it's tailoring an experience to match someone's preferences and meet them where they're at to maximize their experience. But when you take it to its logical extremes, right, when you're performing at that level, it's about creating a subjective experience. And what creates that good subjective experience is by definition then quite difficult to quantify.
I would say that, it really comes down to the rubric and, structuring a rubric that people can get behind and universally, or at least for by and large, a large number of practitioners will feel comfortable with and feel actually proves that the best technique comes out on top. That's what's going to have to be the focus if you're looking at a competition.
But how does that translate? How does that translate outwards, right? Because if you're trying to match and maximize for the experience of the panel, it's not necessarily going to be transferable. And you're not even the person drinking the tea. So the people viewing from the outside are not even participating in the experience. How does that not turn into theater?
Yeah, I guess I would say that it really still, going back to my previous answer, it still comes back to the rubric. If by and large, the tea community agrees upon what the judges, certifications, right, or qualifications are. If by and large the rubric is approved, I don't see why, just like any other competition on a subjective matter or an experience, the skill of a practitioner and the techniques they choose can't be quantified and compared against others. I realize it's not the most objective of formats, but I think you're still able to put a rubric to it with enough scrutiny that will hopefully one day yield a competition that actually progresses the practice, right, of Chinese tea ceremony.
The idea that there's not going to be any subjectivity in a competition ignores that all competitions include some form of subjectivity. Football has coaches that have to make subjective calls. Plein air competitions where individuals are painting out on the streets and then for a few hours and then regather, and the judges judge the plein air art, is a judgment on a subjective experience. So the idea behind the competition is not to remove that, it's to drive the actual applied technique of the praxis, which is either utilitarian or structural functionalist, forward. The overall experience, right? Even a top performer in the competition, if you come over a few weeks after their winning performance, is not going to repeat the performance for you, right? And they're going to probably not craft a little stage and redo their, a new routine. They'll sit down and have tea in a, potentially not in a more casual way, but in a much less performative way. So the idea that the competition itself has to be perfectly well aligned with the phenomenist approach, which I do maintain is the highest level of practice within Chinese tea ceremony, ignores the actual roles of the competition. The role is what is a top-down methodology that can be supported by merchants and industry that's going to drive techniques forward and allow the best techniques to rise to the top.
I think where my focus on competitions are is that, competitions do already exist. Whether or not they have the structure necessary to drive the practice forward is a different question. But, I think only a small portion of the tea community currently embraces the existing competitions. What would have to change about the format or structure to make it a, top-down driver of progression in the practice? Does it have to move further away from entertainment to bring in, high-level practitioners, or does it need to move closer to a form of entertainment to, engage the average tea practitioner?
So the question is essentially whether or not how approachable should it be made?
Yeah, competitions exist, but not everyone likes them. Does it need to be more entertaining, less entertaining to engage, the largest audience?
Well, I think optimizing for a larger audience is probably not a good idea. There's just too many different styles and too many different values, from aesthetics to technique to all types of things throughout the tea world, to have that be unified under a particular method. I mean, I'm still a little bit stuck at, I don't know if you could get the tea, a decent amount of the tea community to agree on a set of guidelines that they would accept. Because I just think of the three of us on this call, like critiquing any existing framework and thinking about other people who are also very involved, how they would critique a framework that we would consider to be a good framework to evaluate someone's brewing technique.
We do not have to get universal buy-in at the beginning. Right? If the competition starts with individuals that are aligned with our praxis and our form of the practice, and grows from there, it can still become a force for positive development.
So tea technique competition 2023. That's what I'm hearing. So I do have kind of another thought on the same line as far as competitions go. Various forms of tea competitions have historically existed, right? It's not like competitions are an ahistorical practice within tea. But I feel like in, our present milieu, right, competitions kind of feel at odds with the culture of tea that has, come to be our contemporary tea culture. I feel like a lot of the current tea community kind of seeks to abandon the worldly and, are interested in maybe some of the more ephemeral spiritual aspects of tea, which I feel that, competitions aren't going to appeal to this group. So do you think there's always going to be like a specific subset of the tea community or culture that embraces competitions? And is that subset too small to progress the praxis? Or do you think that, it would just lead to splintering within the praxis?
Well, that is a great question. Well, I'll actually start by looking further back around the idea that the current group of practitioners do not seem to be aligned with the type of change or the type of promotion that competitions would bring. And the reason I say that, if you think about academia, where people will say or joke, or partially joking or honestly telling the truth via a joke, that the fights are so mean and brutal because the stakes are so small, right? The Qing dynasty culture of the literati was actually very much in the same vein. Individuals would gather people into their courtyard for tea, and while they were there, right, they would show up and they would play the guchang, and then they would show off some of their calligraphic hand scrolls that were ancient, or 100 years old or 200 years old or further back, Song dynasty scrolls. And everyone would ooh and ah over those, and then the tea would be prepared, and they would ooh and ah over that, and there'd be a couple of words around the teas and the wares and the ancient things that they were using, and this would go on, right? And then someone would say, oh, we have to keep up with the Joneses. We have to, now we have to host that same group, and we have to show off our best things, right? And in we have very positive views about the Qing dynasty Chinese literati culture that incubated and arose and that gave birth to this praxis. And some of those views are certainly warranted, right? We aim to see ourselves as the inheritors of literati tradition that remains alive today. But if we look at any of the literati and any of the other more contemporary topics, we can see that the in-group competition and the in-group squabbles are entirely based around who knows what, who owns what, who has access to what. And that is a very normal occurrence. So, despite there not being a formalized competitive structure for someone to say like, oh, I'll take your Yuan dynasty hand scroll by a medium famous artist, and I will up you with the Yuan dynasty hand scroll by a very famous artist, and someone else will say, well, I have Song dynasty, right? There's no formal institution for that, thankfully. Except unless you're donating to museums and comparing the size of your tax write-off. So, this formalized structure is not just about those individuals that already have the knowledge and the access and the economic capital in which to afford to do these things. This is a question about how do we bring more people into the praxis? How do we increase the average level of skill within the practitioner base? And that is a very different question. And that is a question that merchants are already asking. Anyone who owns, a tea shop or a tea bar, particularly a Western-focused tea shop or tea bar, one of the ways that they differentiate themselves is through their educational blogging. They write lots of very nice descriptions around the wares and the history of the wares or the teas that they're doing and the history of those teas and the history of the area, right? And they seek to draw distinctions between that tea and what makes that tea rare and what makes that tea different. Those types of education as marketing work because of the literati tradition. And so when you think about, well, okay, someone can grab this great tea, but is it going to taste good when it's brewed with tap water filled with fluorine and chloride and on an electric kettle, right, and brewed in the Hello Kitty teapot? How is this tea going to do, right? How do we increase the level of average skill, which is something that we've seen happen in coffee, right? I mean, people used to use the bad versions, the Mr. Coffee pots, before everyone slowly started moving over to Chemex, before everyone started slowly moving over to V60, before now people are at Kalita, before they began upgrading their grinders, before the industry began making home grinders, right? So we know that this is all possible. We know that the average level of skill amongst practitioners can be increased, and we see that not happening right now in tea. We see better access in the West to teas and wares. We see access to more information, but not always better information. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of things that only apply in very specific instances, which are incorrectly then applied to more generally. So how can a competition work to progress that? And that's something that I see, as a commercially driven top-down organization, and it would have to be something that merchants get behind. This is not something that I think an independent group of practitioners are going to gather up and do and say, let's go compete with each other.
I'd like to pull on that thread, thinking about raising the average level of the practitioner base. You argued in this chapter that you don't think schools or tests are the most viable top-down method of driving increased skill, right? Basically in the average practitioner level. When I think about schools, I feel that, an introductory school, which teaches maybe very basic technique to absolute beginners, bringing them from a level of beginner to, novice, could pull up the lower end of the practitioner base. I think the argument you make in the chapter is more so that schools aren't going to raise the higher end because no one's going to agree upon what makes one technique better versus another. But do you think that, schools as a method of raising the floor versus raising the ceiling is a good way to drive forward from a top-down perspective, the average level of the practitioner base?
Yes, but I'm very skeptical of merchant-sponsored schools. Right. So where is the commercial basis that allows for those schools to operate and to grow? So if the schools are operated, could be operated by practitioners such as ourselves, which is exactly what we did at the Institute. So having formalized institutions of schools for lower level practitioners to bring them up to a level in which they're able to practice themselves, to propagate the practice themselves, to enter those types of competitions, would be generally very helpful, right? But I think that's a much harder top-down organization to structure because of the difficulty of aligning merchants behind a singular school. Whereas in competitions, the merchants get directly to compete against each other, or if we copy the coffee world, indirectly compete against each other, right? This competitor is competing under their own name using beans sponsored by, whoever. In tea, it could be very much the same. That individual represents themselves and they say that individual works at this tea shop, is using tea from this tea farmer. And there's some reflective glory and everyone's happy if they win and no one's sad if that individual competitor loses, right? Because it's a competition about personal skill, not about the tea or the shop.
I think the one section we have yet to cover is tests. And, you make an argument in the chapter that no institution has the capital to provide some kind of licensing that all practitioners would agree upon. All of us went through a form of licensing where at the Tea Institute, we underwent basically a year of study. We tested. We were doing test very similar to the competition, actually, that you outlined in the chapter, where we're, identifying teas blind, brewing them, providing pre-tasting notes, and providing notes after we've tasted it, identification, etc. There are existing institutions that are doing licensing right now. What are they missing? What do they need to bring their licensing into a light where everyone will agree upon the structure they've laid out?
So I think there's, if you can sort of divide tests into two sections. There's a set of facts that may or may not be agreed upon. I'd say, like, how many different categories of tea are there? Do we include yellow tea? Is it its own category? Et cetera. And then there's objectively true things like blind identification. So I see there's a lot of room for tests for like deductive tasting, very similar to the wine system or like the Q grader system in coffee, where people are designed and where tests are designed and people are trained to work their way backwards to identify something. So is this an oolong? How much has it been roasted? What's the oxidation level? Is it, high mountain, low mountain? And being able to taste for those characteristics where there's an absolute truth at the end. And I actually think that has both a lot of value as a practitioner, because you have to make purchasing decisions. And oftentimes when you're purchasing tea, there's some claims that need to be verified, and having those deductive tasting experiences, separates people who have a lot of experience versus not very much experience. And if you learn on the wrong references, right, then you're really screwed. So someone who has gone through that, right, I think it would raise the practice for everyone. On the other side, where there's information that is not agreed upon, where there are different competing schools of thought, or people categorize things differently, or sometimes it's just outright misinformation, there it gets a little more tricky. Because I think one of the biggest problems of tea in the West is that because consumers, general consumers, off the street consumers, know so little about tea, anyone who dips their toe in the water knows so much more than the average consumer that they don't have a good gauge to know exactly how much or little they know, because they're the relative expert of people around them. So you have these weird little pockets throughout the tea universe of misinformation, disinformation, or different groups of people categorizing things differently, where we don't have an agreed upon set of facts.
Yeah, my take is that schools and tests are frequently paired together, and they suffer from the same problem. So we would need to have an independent institution, independent from merchants, promoting good information that was acceptable across the spectrum. All right, so I think that when we ran the institute and we ran a test. The Institute was, an independent, academically focused organization that could run a legitimate licensing, was independent enough that it didn't matter if anyone was threatened by it, right? They really couldn't stop Penn State University from running its own licensing. Was the value of that licensing high? Was it low? Right? It certainly went on to a lot of resumes. It's certainly something that's notable. Did it make a major impact on the industry and change, what people are practicing? Really only for the students that went through the program. That's all the time that we have for today. I would like to leave this section, this chapter, as a call to action. If you are a practitioner and you have strong opinions or weak opinions or opinions that can inspire debate, please do leave them in the comments. This is something that's open for debate and discussion. This is not something that we're immediately planning on taking any action on. And in fact, we really do hope that this inspires others to take action. So this chapter ends on the idea The further development of schools, tests, and competitions is left as an exercise to the reader. And I do hope that someone will take up the charge on that. So thank you for joining this edition of T-Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for a discussion on the next chapter, a Bordeauxian analysis for the construction of an education in T.